The ice did not crack loudly. It groaned. A deep, slow sound, like the earth itself was in pain. Like the sound of bones breaking in slow motion. In the endless white silence of Antarctica, where sound travels differently, where the air is so cold it burns your lungs, that sound meant only one thing. Death was coming. And there was nowhere to run. London, England. December 1913. Sir Ernest Shackleton stood before a map of Antarctica, his finger tracing a line across the frozen continent. He was 39 years old, a veteran polar explorer who had come within 97 miles of the South Pole in 1909, closer than any man before him. But he had turned back. He chose his men's lives over glory. Now someone else had reached the pole. Roald Amundsen had planted his flag there in 1911. The race was over. But Shackleton saw a different challenge. No one had ever crossed Antarctica from sea to sea. The Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition was born, not from ego, but from an unshakable belief that human beings could achieve the impossible if they worked together. Shackleton placed an advertisement in London newspapers. Men wanted for hazardous journey. Small wages. Bitter cold. Long months of complete darkness. Constant danger. Safe return doubtful. Honor and recognition in case of success. 5,000 men applied. He chose 27. Not the strongest, not the most experienced, but the ones he believed could endure together. Scientists, sailors, carpenters, a photographer, a surgeon, even a stowaway 18-year-old Perce Blackborough who Shackleton eventually accepted with the grim joke, "If we run out of food, you'll be the first we eat." They were ordinary men about to face the most extraordinary environment on Earth. On August 8, 1914, the same day Britain entered World War I, the ship Endurance departed Plymouth, England. Shackleton had named her after his family motto, "By endurance we conquer." He had no idea how prophetic that name would become. By December 1914, Endurance had reached South Georgia Island, the last outpost of civilization. Whalers there warned Shackleton, the ice was worse than usual this year. That's unforgiving. He pressed on anyway. On December 5, they sailed south into the Weddell Sea. For 6 weeks, navigator Frank Worsley steered the ship through narrow channels between ice floes, sometimes advancing only a few miles per day. The crew heard the ice scraping against the wooden hull, a constant eerie sound. Then, on January 19, 1915, just one day's sail from their destination, everything stopped. The temperature dropped suddenly. The ice closed in. Endurance was frozen solid. At first, the men weren't worried. Ships got stuck in ice all the time. When spring came, the ice would melt. They waited. January became February. February became March. The ice did not melt. Instead, something worse began to happen. The pack ice was not still. It was alive, constantly moving, driven by winds and ocean currents. Massive ice floes, some the size of football fields, pressed against each other with unimaginable force. And Endurance was caught between them. The ship began to groan. First, it was just occasional creaking, normal for a wooden ship. But by September, the sounds became terrifying. Deep moans, sharp cracks, the sound of wood screaming under pressure. Frank Worsley, the captain, described it in his journal. The ship twisted and writhed like a living creature in agony. The ice was not just holding the ship, it was crushing it. On October 24, 1915, the pressure became unbearable. Massive ice blocks pressed against the hull. The ship rose out of the water, tilted at impossible angles. Seams split. Freezing water poured into the lower decks. Shackleton gathered his crew on the ice. His voice was calm, steady. "Ship and stores have gone, so now we'll go home." Just like that. No panic. No blame. No despair. On October 27th, he gave the final order, "Abandon ship." The men salvaged what they could. 3 lifeboats, tents, sleeping bags, food supplies, scientific instruments. Frank Hurley, the photographer, even rescued his photographic plates, smashing hundreds to save the best 120, preserving this nightmare for history. They camped on the ice nearby and watched. For weeks, Endurance fought. The ice lifted her stern into the air. Her mast snapped like twigs. Her sides splintered. On November 21st, she finally surrendered. The ice opened beneath her, and Endurance slipped into the black water, stern first, and vanished into the depths of the Weddell Sea. 28 men stood in silence, watching their only link to civilization disappear. They were now completely alone, on floating ice, in the most remote place on Earth, more than 1,000 miles from the nearest human settlement. No radio, No rescue coming. No one even knew exactly where they were. And the Antarctic winter, with its months of total darkness and temperatures reaching minus 40 degrees Celsius, was just beginning. Shackleton called it Ocean Camp. It was a cluster of tents on an ice floe, drifting slowly north with the pack ice. The men had no control over where they went. They were passengers on a frozen raft. This is where Shackleton's true genius emerged. He understood that Antarctica would not kill these men. Despair would. So he created structure, routine, purpose. Every man had duties. The scientists continued their observations. The crew maintained equipment. Meals happened at the same time every day, even when food was scarce. He enforced cleanliness. Even in minus 30-degree temperatures, the men washed. They kept their sleeping bags as dry as possible. They changed socks. These small acts of civilization mattered. Because every day they did these things, they remembered they were still human. Food became the central challenge. They had salvaged some supplies from the Endurance, but not enough. Shackleton made the agonizing decision to shoot the dogs, the beloved sled dogs that had lived with them for months. The men wept as they did it. But the dogs' meat kept them alive. They also hunted seals and penguins. The killing was brutal, intimate. A seal could feed the crew for days. They used everything: meat for food, blubber for fuel, skin for repairs. Photographer Frank Hurley wrote, "We have become savages. We stink of seal blood. Our hands are black with blubber. But we are alive." The ice beneath them was never still. It cracked without warning. Sometimes men woke to find a split running through the middle of their tent. They would scramble out in the darkness, drag their gear across the gap, and set up again. Every day Shackleton walked among the men. He watched them, listened to them, sensed who was struggling. He paired the pessimists with the optimists. He gave the weakest men the warmest sleeping bags, including giving up his own. He settled disputes before they festered. When the men were hungry, he was hungry. When they were cold, he was cold. He never asked them to endure anything he wouldn't endure himself. Months passed like this. The sun disappeared entirely in June, the Antarctic winter. 4 weeks, they lived in total darkness, lit only by blubber lamps that filled their tents with greasy smoke. Men's beards froze to their sleeping bags at night. Frostbite claimed toes, fingers, noses. The ice floe they lived on began to shrink as it drifted north into warmer waters. By April 1916, their frozen island was breaking apart. Shackleton made a decision. They would take to the sea. On April 9, 1916, the men launched 3 small lifeboats into the Southern Ocean. The James Caird, the Dudley Docker, the Stancomb Wills. These boats were designed for coastal sailing, not open ocean. But they were all that stood between 28 men and death. The sea was a nightmare. Waves rose 30 feet high. Wind tore at the sails. Spray froze instantly, coating the boats in ice that made them heavier, slower, more likely to capsize. The men bailed water constantly with any container they had: cups, cans, their boots. They couldn't lie down. They couldn't get warm. They couldn't rest. For 7 days and 7 nights they endured this hell. Some men hallucinated. Others fell into hypothermic stupors. Shackleton rotated between the boats, shouting encouragement, keeping spirits up, making sure no one gave up. On April 15th, through fog and spray, they saw it. Land. Elephant Island. A barren, wind-blasted rock in the Southern Ocean. No trees. No shelter. No people. But it was solid ground. When the boats scraped onto the rocky beach, men fell to their knees and kissed the stones. Some wept. Others just stared, unable to believe they were standing on something that didn't move. It was the first land they had touched in 497 days. But Shackleton knew the truth immediately. Elephant Island was a refuge, not a rescue. No shipping lanes passed this way. No explorers visited. The island was too remote, too worthless. If they stayed here, they would die here. Slowly. Miserably. Shackleton gathered his officers: Frank Worsley, the brilliant navigator; Tom Crean, the tough Irish sailor; Frank Wild, his second in command. He told them his plan. He would take 5 men in the James Caird, the largest lifeboat, and sail 800 miles across the most violent ocean on Earth to South Georgia Island. The men stared at him. It was madness. The boat was 22 feet long. The Southern Ocean produced waves that sank steel ships. Navigation would depend on brief sightings of the sun through storms. If they missed South Georgia, a tiny island in an enormous ocean, they would sail into the Atlantic and die. But it was the only chance. Shackleton chose his crew carefully: Worsley to navigate, Crean and 2 sailors, McCarthy and Vincent, for their strength, and carpenter Harry McNish, who modified the boat, building a makeshift deck to keep waves from swamping them. On April 24, 1916, the James Caird pushed off from Elephant Island. Frank Wild, left in command, watched them disappear into the fog. He had no idea if he would ever see Shackleton again. The journey of the James Caird is considered one of the greatest feats of navigation in maritime history. For 16 days, 6 men fought the Southern Ocean. Waves crashed over the tiny boat constantly. The makeshift deck kept them from sinking, but it also meant they were trapped in a dark, wet coffin, unable to see what was coming. Ice formed on everything. Their sleeping bags froze solid. Their clothes became suits of ice armor. Sleep came in minutes, not hours. They took turns at the tiller, 4 hours on, 4 hours off. The man not steering tried to rest, wedged between supplies, too cold and wet to actually sleep. Navigation was Frank Worsley's domain. To find South Georgia, he needed to take sun sightings with a sextant. But in storm conditions, this was nearly impossible. He had to wait for rare breaks in the clouds, scramble onto the bucking deck, balance on ice-covered boards, and take his reading before the next wave hit. If his calculations were off by even a degree, they would miss the island entirely. On day 12, they hit a storm worse than anything they'd experienced. A wave, Shackleton later described it as a mighty upheaval of the ocean, rose out of the darkness. It was so large he thought it was a break in the clouds at first. It crashed over them with the force of a collapsing building. The boat nearly capsized. They bailed frantically, knowing if the boat filled with water, they would sink in seconds. They survived. On day 14 they saw birds. Birds meant land. On day 16, May 10, 1916, they saw cliffs. South Georgia Island. But their ordeal was not over. They had landed on the wrong side of the island. The whaling stations, civilization, rescue, help, were on the opposite coast. Between them and safety stood unmapped mountains, glaciers, ice fields, terrain that had never been crossed. The men were exhausted, starving, barely able to walk. Shackleton gave them 1 day to rest. Then he made another impossible decision. He would cross the island on foot. On May 19, 1916, Shackleton set out with Tom Crean and Frank Worsley. They had no map, no climbing equipment, no rope. Just 50 feet of rope salvaged from the boat, an ice axe and carpenter's nails driven into the soles of their boots for traction. They had 32 miles to cross. Through mountains no human had ever seen. They climbed glaciers in the dark, crossed frozen rivers, navigated around crevasses that could swallow them without a trace. At one point, they reached the top of a ridge and found a sheer ice slope descending into fog. They had no idea what was at the bottom, solid ice, rocks, a cliff edge. But going back would take hours they didn't have. Shackleton made a decision. They sat down, one behind the other, locked legs and pushed off. They slid down thousands of feet of ice in complete darkness, accelerating to terrifying speeds, unable to stop or steer. They hit the bottom in a snowbank and tumbled apart. For a moment they just lay there. Then Crean started laughing. Then Worsley. Then Shackleton. Because they were alive. For 36 hours they walked without stopping. Without sleeping. Driven by will alone. Finally, at 6:30 a.m. on May 20th, they heard something that made them stop. A whistle. The whaling station's morning whistle, signaling the start of the workday. It was the first human sound they had heard, other than their own voices, in over a year. They stumbled down the final slope into Stromness whaling station. The Norwegian whalers who saw them didn't recognize them at first. They looked like ghosts, emaciated, bearded, their clothes in rags, their faces blackened by blubber smoke. The station manager, Thorolf Sorel, stared at them. Then Shackleton spoke. "My name is Shackleton." Sorel stepped back in shock. The world had given up Ernest Shackleton for dead a year ago. Shackleton continued, his voice hoarse. "We've lost our ship. We've been on the ice for over a year. And I've left 22 men on Elephant Island. I need to get them back." The rescue was not simple. It took 4 attempts. The first 3 times, pack ice blocked the way to Elephant Island. Ships couldn't get through. Meanwhile, on Elephant Island, Frank Wild kept the men alive. Every morning he said the same thing, "Lads, the boss is coming today." Days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to months. The men grew weaker. Some gave up hope. But Wild never did. Finally, on August 30, 1916, 4 months after Shackleton had left, a Chilean ship, the Yelcho, broke through the ice. Frank Wild saw it first. He shouted, "The boss is coming." The men emerged from their makeshift shelter, a stone hut covered with the overturned lifeboats. They were skeletal, bearded. Some could barely walk. Shackleton stood at the ship's rail, counting heads as they stumbled toward the boat. When he reached 22, his shoulders sagged in relief. Every man was alive. Not one life lost. Over 634 days. Through the Antarctic winter. Through starvation, frostbite, and despair. Every single man made it home. Ernest Shackleton did not achieve his goal. He never crossed Antarctica. The Endurance lies crushed at the bottom of the Weddell Sea. The expedition was, by every measure, a failure. But history remembers it differently. Because Shackleton understood something fundamental about leadership. Success is not about reaching the destination. It is about bringing everyone home. In a world that celebrates conquest, Shackleton showed us the power of care. In a world that worships individual achievement, he showed us the strength of the collective. When the Endurance was crushed, he did not cling to his dream. He let it go. And he saved his men. Today, over a century later, Ernest Shackleton's expedition stands as the greatest survival story ever told. Not because they conquered Antarctica, but because, against impossible odds, they conquered something far more powerful. They conquered despair. And they did it together.